Good afternoon, students. So today in this video, we'll see the topological worms, email worms and peer-to-peer worms, and further part of this chapter. Topological worms are so called because the machines vulnerable to such a worm can be represented as a graph with the nodes representing the vulnerable machines. An edge between machine A and machine B exists if A knows or stores the address of B and is capable of directly infecting B by sending it a malicious payload. Topological worms have focused targets. Their immediate targets are their neighbors, who in turn spread the infection to their neighbors and so on. Thus, their rate of spreading is potentially faster than internet scanning worms, which typically scans the IP addresses space randomly, incurring many futile probe attempts. So in this, we study two types of topological worms. First one is an email worm and another is a peer-to-peer worm. Email worm propagates through infected email. The victim receives email that comes from trusted or familiar source. The victim receives email that appears to have come from a trusted or a familiar source. On other occasions, the email recipient is lured by an attachment with a catchy caption. So in either case, the worm is activated when the user clicks on the attachment. A classic example of an email worm is the I love you worm, unleashed in 2000. It appears in the victim's inbox sporting the catchy title I love you. The victim sees an innocent text file attached to the email. In reality, the file named such as loveletter.txt.vbs contains the Visual Basic script. By clicking on this attachment, the embedded VB script executes, sending a copy of itself to every person in the victim's contact list. Many email worms exploit the fact that documents created by certain word processor embed software micros in them. The micros execute when the document is open. For example, Melissa was a microworm that propagated by sending copies of itself to the first 50 persons in the victim's address book. One of the best known email worm of more recent vintages is Sobik, which was let choose in 2003. It spread by communicating malicious email or copying itself to an open network share. There were several versions of Sobik. One version could update itself by downloading code from certain websites. The URLs of these sites were contained in a file that itself was downloadable from geocities.com. This site allows users to host their own free web pages besides providing tools in support of building dynamic web pages. Some of the malicious code received installed a keystroke logger and stole passwords from its victims. Second one is a peer-to-peer worms. A peer-to-peer network is a massively distributed system of computers where each peer or a node plays the role of both client and server. They are usually principally for sharing files which may contain songs, images, videos, etc. Each peer maintains within itself a share folder of files that it is willing to share with others. Users do not download files from a central server, but from their peers located across the globe. They are immensely popular, as evidenced by the fact that a very large proportion of internet traffic is comprised of peer-to-peer packets. To see how peer-to-peer worm spread, it is important to understand how a peer-to-peer network operates. Most peer-to-peer networks use an overlay network, which is a logical network of peers. Two peers are said to be neighbors at any given point of time if there is an active TCP connection between them. So here are some potential ways in which peer-to-peer worms may spread. One of the simplest is for a malicious peer to respond positively to any query. If the requester then chooses to download the file from the malicious peer, the latter sends it an infected file whose name is changed to match that of the requested file. The infected file contains a worm which passes on its infection to the requester. Once infected, the requester mimics the behavior of the malicious peer, thus helping to propagate the infection. Alternatively, various popular files stored in the shared folder of a peer may be infected. When any of them is downloaded, the infection spreads to the share folder of the requesting peer. Peers in a given peer-to-peer network run the same peer-to-peer protocol. There are usually few different implementations of this protocol, leading to little software diversity. An exploitable buffer overflow vulnerability is one popular implementation, is a familiar starting point. This, coupled with the fact that a peer maintains a list of neighbors, implies that a worm has ready targets and does not need to perform random scanning as in the case of internet scanning worms. The first type of worm is said to be passive since it propagates only when requested to download a file. The second type of worm is active since it propagates on its own without receiving requests from its peers. One aspect of peer-to-peer worms is that they may result in no apparent traffic anomaly, so an intrusion detection system monitoring network traffic is unlikely to raise an alert. So next one is a web worms. Web worms differs from malware such as the internet scanning worms in several ways. Many web forms are executed in browser which run on diverse hardware or operating system platforms. Web worms are written in a high-level language, making it easy to perform complex operations but difficult to execute low-level operations. On the other hand, many other worms are written in assembly language. One type of web worm is the XSS worm, so called since it exploits cross-site scripting vulnerabilities in web servers. The first step in creating an XSS worm is to inject attack code into a vulnerable web server. When a user accesses the infected website through his or her browser, the malicious code is downloaded onto the browser. As in any XSS vulnerability, malicious code executes on the browser. Given that a key function of a worm is to propagate, the challenging question is, how does an XSS worm propagate? A partial answer to this question may be found through our next case study of SAMI worm. So next is the XSS worm case study. XSS worm SAMI was unleashed in October 2005, authored by Sami Kamkar. It infected the social networking site MySpace. Social networking sites typically allow users to create and edit their profiles, which are stored on the site and are accessible to other members of the social networking group. A user profile may contain information about him, including his hobbies, photographs, etc. A user profile also contains a list of the user's friends with hyperlinks to their profiles. Sami added a bunch of carefully crafted JavaScript to his profile. When a visitor to Sami's website, say V1, downloaded Sami's profile onto his browser, the JavaScript in Sami's profile executed. This caused Sami to be added as a friend in V1's profile and also to include the message, "But most of all, Sami is my hero." Within 20 hours of the first visit to Sami's profile, Sami had been added as a friend to more than 1 million user profiles. This rate of spread was even faster than the code rate. How did the worm spread and why did it spread so fast? The malicious JavaScript uploaded itself onto V1's profile on the MySpace server, thus infecting it. This is done by an HTTP post request sent from the browser to the server. However, that would cause the screen to freeze between sending the request and receiving the HTTP response from the server. To ensure that the viewer had a normal screen experience, SAMI's JavaScript created an XML HTTP request object, which was used to send the malicious JavaScript to the MySpace server. Unlike the regular HTTP request, the message from an XML HTTP request object is asynchronous and runs in the background. So next one, it's a mobile malware. New generation smartphones combine the functionality of cell phone and a loose end personal computer. They may be used for storing confidential documents, communicating via email, SMS, MMS, and taking photographs. They support feature-rich applications that run on top of a complete operating system. The most common operating system on smartphones is the Symbian, followed by Windows Mobile, Linux, and recently the Mac OS X, which is used on the iPhone. They provide a rich set of APIs to access the phone book and other files, send SMS, MMS messages, etc. Unfortunately, these very APIs can also be used by malware to, for example, read a confidential document on the smartphone and ship it to the attacker as an MMS attachment. Another feature that many smartphones have these days is Bluetooth connectivity. Bluetooth supports a host of tasks such as exchange of e-business cards between two smartphone users, communication with point-of-sale terminals, headset to smartphone communications, and syncing between a smartphone and a personal computer. So Bluetooth is both a communication technology and a protocol stack. As a communication technology, it supports short-range wireless communication, that is a maximum of between 10 and 100 meters between devices. Like Wi-Fi, Bluetooth uses 2.4 gigahertz shortwave radio technology. Its power requirements are considerably lower than the Wi-Fi. Its transmission speed is limited to 5 Mbps. Bluetooth is a complex multi-layered protocol. The implementation of Bluetooth on Linux system exceeds 25,000 lines of kernel code. So in this Bluetooth, we are going to see discovery and user authorization, link level security, and some of the examples. So first we'll see discovery and user authorization. Besides the vulnerabilities mentioned above, social engineering is a key factor in the spread of mobile malware. Many personal computer users do not hesitate to click hot links in their email or open attachment even when the sender of the email is unknown. This behavior carries over to the mobile world, where many users have no hesitation in accepting a file from an unknown source. The combination of Bluetooth implementation vulnerabilities, rich feature set of the smartphones, and unthinking user behavior has exposed the smartphone to various strains of malware. To investigate the spread of malware in smartphones, it is necessary to understand the basics of how smartphone exchanges files using Bluetooth. To discover other Bluetooth-enabled devices in its neighborhood, a device initiates an inquiry procedure which includes broadcasting an inquiry request. All devices in the range of initiator that are in discoverable mode respond sending their Bluetooth device address, which we call it as a Bluetooth device address. So this is a 48-bit MAC address. The first 20 bits identify the device manufacturer or a model, and the last 24 bits specifies a particular instance of that model. As Bluetooth is a connection-oriented protocol, a device A can set up a connection to any other device B. But to set up such a connection, A should know the Bluetooth device address of a B. One way of obtaining B's Bluetooth device address is through the discovery procedure, which already we have studied. A large percentage of users keep their phones in discoverable mode, so this is an attractive way of harvesting device addresses, especially in crowded areas such as railway stations or malls. However, it should be noted that even with the phone in non-discoverable mode, there are a number of brute force techniques to extract its Bluetooth device address. Knowing Bluetooth device address A could attempt to exchange files with it using OBEX, that is Object Exchange Protocol. A session protocol that resembles HTTP, OBEX is used to transfer images, business cards, and other files between Bluetooth devices. An attacker A could use OBEX push to transfer a file containing malicious code to user B. User authorization is usually required before a file can be accepted by his smartphone. Each user selects a PIN which varies between 4 and 16 characters long, but 4 characters are typically used. The smartphones usually prompts a user to enter his or her PIN as a way to confirm whether an external file, for example, should be accepted. Some operating system versions accept file transfer without user authorization, and some smartphones allow users to disable the authorization required option for file transfers. So next one is a link level security. The level of security provided by user authorization alone is generally inadequate. Another level of security provided by Bluetooth is link level authentication and encryption. For this purpose, both sides compute a common secret called the link key. Bluetooth uses a procedure called pairing, wherein this key is computed by two participating devices. Pairing is preceded by discovery or inquiry and paging. The latter is a procedure whereby the discovering device A establishes a connection with the discovered device B. So next one, how to compute the link key. In that we have the two steps. The first step in deriving the common link key between A and B is to compute an initialization key KINIT. So this is a function of the Bluetooth device address of B and a nonce in random number generated by A, which is shown in the next figure. Before the pairing procedure, the owners of A and B must agree in an offline manner on a temporary pin to be used specifically as part of the pairing procedure. Now, if you see, so in this figure, first the KINIT, the initial key, is going to be derived by using the BD, that is Bluetooth device address of the B, which is a 48-bit. Then it has used the pin. From that, 128-bit key is going to be used. Both users then type in the temporary pin. KINIT is also a function of this temporary pin agreed to by both parties. KINIT is computed from in random number Bluetooth device address 0 and the pin using an algorithm E22 based on a block cipher called Cipher Plus. Second, to compute the link key, A and B each generates a random number, say LK underscore RANDA and LK underscore RANDB respectively. Each party then performs an XOR of its random number with, and they each transmit this across. Each side recovers the other party's random number by performing an XOR of the received value with a KINIT. Now each side has LK underscore RANDA, LK underscore RANDB and the two device addresses, that is Bluetooth address of A and B. They then perform identical operations on these to obtain the link key KAB, as shown in the figure. The operations involve the use of an algorithm E21, which, like E22, is based on the CIFAR plus. Thereafter, each device stores the pair Bluetooth address of the other device and the newly computed link key in a database. Each device maintains such a database of Bluetooth address link key pairs, one pair per device it is paired up with. So now in this you can see here we have a link key random number A generated by A, LA underscore RANDB. Then it is going to be XORed with a K in it. Same thing is done by this. After performing the XOR, then it is going to again XOR with a Bluetooth addresses of A and a B with a K in it. And by using this E21, which is a CIFAR plus algorithm, which is again XOR, we will be getting the link key as KAB. And this will be independently calculated on both the sets. Then using the link key. The link key is used for both authentication and encryption. Now, after computing this key, now this link key is going to be used for the authentication and encryption purpose. Suppose A and B were already paired. Let KA be their common link key. Now, suppose A wishes to authenticate B. For this purpose, it generates a random number and sends it to B. The response computed by B is E1, that is the link key KAB, random number A and Bluetooth address B. Then hacking the link key. It is possible to launch a dictionary attack by sniffing each message involved in pairing and authentication. So these attacks enable an eavesdropper to obtain the link key KAB. Making it possible for the attacker to impersonate B to A. The latest version of Bluetooth version 2.1 gets rid of this problem by using elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman key exchange algorithm. The idea is similar to that of the EKE protocol used. There are social engineering attacks that enable an attacker to pair his device with that of a careless user. Imagine an attacker who has obtained the Bluetooth address of a user during the discovery procedure. The attacker's device then makes a pairing request to the victim. Pairing requests contain the common name of the requester, such as Bobby. Note that one can change one's common name, but not the Bluetooth address of one's smartphone. So in this case, the attacker sports a fancy name such as your admirer. As in phishing attacks, the victim is lured to respond to the pairing request, but there is a one caveat. Don't the attacker and victim have to agree on a pairing pin? The answer is yes. However, many people may scant attention to the choice of a pin and frequently use simple attacker to pair his device with the device of a careless user. There are examples. Caviar was one of the earliest proof of concept worm that targeted the Symbian Series 60 operating system. Unleashed in June 2004, it was authored by International Virus Writing Group 29A. The worm attempts to discover other Bluetooth-enabled phones set in discoverable mode. When it finds such a phone, it sends the worm payload in a SIS file. The receiver needs to accept and install the file. Its payload was mostly benign, typically displaying Caribe on the screen. However, the continuous scanning for new victims by an infected phone depletes battery power. Coronavirus, which appeared in March 2005, was the first worm to spread through the Bluetooth and MMS. Like Kabir, it targeted Symbian smartphones. So the last point of this chapter is botnets. So first we'll see some of the basic parts. A botnet is an army of compromised computers or bots connected to the internet and remotely controlled by a bootmaster. The earliest botnets were a collection of zombies that participated in distributed denial of service attacks. The emergence of botnets is closely linked to the motive of financial gain that is behind many recent cyber attacks. They are often used to send spam mail on behalf of third parties. For example, bot programs may contain keyloggers and other forms of spyware that capture sensitive personal information such as password and credit card numbers and send these to the bootmaster. Botnets have also been used as an extortion tool. Pay up or your website will be bombarded by a distributed denial of service attack. How does a computer become a bot? Bots are created in ways similar to many of traditional Trojan, worm, or virus infection. A common vector of propagation is email that contains an infected attachment. Another is through downloading a malicious web page containing scripts that exploit vulnerabilities in certain browsers or application software. A bot infection may also be propagated by bots themselves by scanning the internet for vulnerable machines. Finally, open file shares and internet relay chat multicast messages have also been widely used to spread infections. One important difference between a bot and a computer infected by a traditional worm, virus, or Trojan is that a bot needs to communicate with specific nodes in the botnet to receive fresh commands. A bot may be ordered to send spam or to launch a distributed denial of service attack on site. Suppose it's abc.com beginning 2 hours on 1/12/2010. Some of the nodes in the botnet play the role of command and control servers. They receive commands from the bot master and disseminate these to the rest of the bots. So here is a case study, the Storm botnet. The Storm botnet was first detected in January 2007. Its other names are Picom, Noor, and Gelatin. Bots in the Storm botnet are infected in stages. The most common vectors for propagating the primary infection appear to be an email or infected websites. Email was sent with sensational subject lines like 230 die as Storm batters Europe. Likewise, users were lured into downloading free but infected files from the website containing music of various pop artists. The primary infection instructed the victim to join the Storm Hornet embedded in the Overnet peer-to-peer network. Once part of the botnet, the bot was programmed to receive the second and subsequent injections of malicious code. One of the injection instructed the bot to propagate email viruses. Another injection received some days later instructed the bot to launch a distributed denial of service attack on a target specified by the bot master. So this is what the further part of the virus, worms, and malware.